Our final speaker is Aaron Panofsky. Aaron is an associate professor in the Department of Public Policy and the Center for Society and Genetics at the University of California, Los Angeles. He has a PhD in sociology from New York University. He's been a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Scholar at the University of California, Berkeley. And he and his co-authors received the Robert E. Park Best Paper Award from the Community and Urban Sociology section of the American Sociological Association. His book, Misbehaving Science, has just come out this summer from University of Chicago Press. Aaron Panofsky.
Very good. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for staying till the end. I look forward to hearing your questions afterwards. Let me start with a few definitions. So first, the field of behavioral genetics is the field that talks about genes for or genetic influences on traits like intelligence, personality, mental illness, aggressive or criminal behavior, and so forth. And scientific racism, I want to give a sort of analytic definition. So I'm not talking about malice in the heart, so sort of overt racial hatred, nor am I talking about implicit bias. I'm really talking about the idea that science proves that supposed differences among racial groups are biologically given, right? So look, there's a dictionary definition of racism. I mean, the idea that that racial differences, racial hierarchies are biologically given. And so the question is that I'm going to talk about today is how has the field of behavioral genetics become so associated with this idea of scientific racism? Well, one of the main ways is that it has been associated with people that have, or scientists that have put forth ideas that I think can reasonably be classified as scientific racism. So Arthur Jensen in 1969 dropped a sort of a real academic bombshell when he argued, drawing from behavioral genetic research, both animal research and human research, that IQ is an excellent measure of intelligence, that there are large differences between black and white groups, that genetics, that IQ is largely genetically determined, and that it's a pretty strong possibility that a lot of the difference between blacks and whites, between the divergence of their bell curves in IQ, are due to genetic factors. 25 years later, Herrnstein and Murray wrote the bell curve. This is probably more in everyone's memory, which basically made a very similar argument that that American social structure in economic inequality had a large genetic component to it, that the reason why blacks and Latinos did worse or do worse on IQ tests than whites probably had a large genetic component, and that American social policy should really try to accommodate this reality, this inherent reality. And then you have people like, Philippe Rushton, who also in 1994 wrote a book called Race, Evolution, and Behavior, and he tried to put this idea of inherent racial differences in a sort of broad evolutionary scale, and he basically argued that there's a sort of supposed behavioral and civilizational hierarchy with Asians at the top, whites in the middle, and blacks in the bottom. So it's not a white supremacy argument exactly, because it's sort of an Asian supremacy argument. And that this could be explained by an evolutionary sexual selection strategy where Asians basically have large brains and small penises, invest heavily in their children, and therefore are and have evolved kind of restraint and civilization capabilities. And black people have had the reverse strategy. They have large penises, small brains, and they have evolved to be sort of sexually profligate and civilizationally less developed. And so this is an argument he made in a book that many of you probably received in the mail at some point, as I did. Anyway, And then there's others, right? So those are sort of a big three, but there's a sort of a set of other people, and there are even others that I could have put up here. People that have been associated with behavioral genetics and have advanced various versions of genetic explanations for purported racial differences in different kinds of behavioral traits. And so a question that is often raised is, well, should we think of behavioral genetics as racist science? And the question I want to address today is, why have so many scientific racists? And I put that in quote marks, but I think it's sort of an analytic definition. Again, I don't know what's in these people's hearts, how they vote, things like that. But that they've advanced these ideas. And why have so many of them found a home in behavioral genetics, or some kind of sanctuary in behavioral genetics, if not exactly a comfortable home? And my answer, as I'll try to show this my argument in a nutshell, is that the rational explanations don't really work, but that we need to think about, on the one hand, the history of how the field coped with controversy, coped with racial controversy, in particular Jensen, and how that ended up enrolling scientific racist arguments or race researchers into the field. And then secondly, I think we need to think about the ways that race helps behavioral genetics build certain kinds of images of strength, and I'll explain what I mean by that in the end. So first, let me say that race claims are considered by behavioral geneticists a problem for their field. So when I interviewed a lot of these, there's a lot of text, I apologize. These are mostly quotes from people that I interviewed, or else quotes from articles, and you can tell the difference because I have a citation for the articles. But people I interviewed said things like, look, when the Jensen controversy happened in 1969, early 70s, our field became suddenly too controversial to fund. People really thought it was going to be the end of human behavioral genetics. And people still today talk about, I did the interviews a few years ago, but in the contemporary period, talk about how race research was sort of spreading disrepute throughout the field. So one scientist I interviewed was a fruit fly behavior researcher. And she talked about how people always talk to her, look, if you call yourself a behavior geneticist, you're supporting a field that's inhuman in the long run. And that she's found her own research, even though it's on fruit flies, roped into arguments about race. She says, I even found my research cited as supporting the idea that mixing races leads to reduced fertility. So what might behavior geneticists do about this? Well, on one hand, if they wanted to be sort of one way to sort of legitimate themselves as a field, make themselves sort of more authoritative and legitimate, they might, on the one hand, in kind of ordinary sociological theory, try to kick these guys out. Say, look, the race research is not a part of our field. Let's get rid of this sort of stigmatized bad science and stick to the good stuff. Or they might, on the other hand, say, look, it may be unpopular, but this is good science. Ultimately, the race research, those hypotheses are reasonable, and that they actually have some empirical support and theoretical support. And so the question, let me start with that second question first. Is race ultimately a kind of inconvenient truth, right? Is behavior genetics the field that is ultimately giving some, telling bravely an inconvenient truth that that everyone else, all the other scientific fields want to walk into the reassuring lie? Well, I found that the case when I interviewed behavioral geneticists that for the most part, they don't believe that their field has tools to support the claim of racial differences in intelligence and behavior. So one person I spoke with said, look, the problem with Rushton is that people consider his work a flawed analysis, and this is someone who's actually a politically conservative, believes that Rushton's work just was fundamentally flawed. It wasn't good science. Another person I spoke with, and this is a sentiment I heard actually fairly widely, was that that the field just doesn't have the tools to evaluate the genetic hypothesis, right? It cannot substantiate whether or not blacks and whites have genetically determined different capacities. And so there was a little bit of debate among the people that I spoke with as to whether the old twin studies, which there's sort of broad consensus that can't do the work of finding genes for racial differences. And there's some of the people thought, well, maybe the molecular genetic stuff in the future will be able to do this. But the person I spoke with here is a person who's deeply invested in molecular genetics, and he was saying, look, I don't even think that the molecular genetics is going to do this for us. Okay. And then this is a quote that is very pithy. David Botstein, who isn't really a behavior geneticist, but he talked about when he was asked why the genetics community didn't do more to refute the bell curve, to refute the genetic races, he said, the problem is it's too stupid to rebut. I'm not going to spend my time on talking about this. And so the question, to return to that inconvenient truth question, well, is it a true inconvenient truth? It's certainly inconvenient for the behavior geneticists, and they acknowledge that, but I don't think that they widely consider it what Jensen, Rushton, and others like them to say to be true in the sense of having good scientific support to be a valid scientific question. Well, so maybe it's just that behavior geneticists have a really strong commitment to scientific freedom. So one person I interviewed said, look, the Russians of the world would never be taken as spokesmen for us, but I'm not going to spend my time, trying to denounce them. One of the prices that I'm willing to pay for academic freedom is to have outliers, the Russians of the world, be parts of my field. Okay, so it's nice that they are defending scientific freedom, but the notion of scientific freedom is not licensed to say anything you want and call it science, right? So in some sort of technical sense, scientific freedom ensures the freedom of inquiry as long as you adhere to the standards of science. But according to many of my interviews, some of the quotes that I gave you just a second ago, this science is flawed, and these hypotheses cannot be validated using the tools that they recognize as the strongest tools of the field. So in some sense, the idea of defending this as scientific freedom is to defend something that they believe is non-scientific as deserving the label of science. And that's sort of a strange thing here. So, okay, despite everything I said, there have been tepid endorsements by behavioral geneticists of the kinds of claims that not so much Rushton have made, but the more mild claims like ones that Jensen and others have made. So, for example, in 1975, Lolan, Lindsay, and Spuler wrote that the observed differences between the IQ scores in blacks and whites probably reflect some environment, probably reflect some bias in the tests, and they probably in part reflect genetic differences among these groups. And so in 1994, in response to the bell curve, a very similar claim was made. So this is like an editorial in the Wall Street Journal that was collectively signed by 20-odd behavioral geneticists, and they said that there's a lot of weasel words in this statement, but most experts believe that there could be some influence of genetics as well as other factors that are driving the curves apart. So let me just talk about to summarize what I've said so far. So the scandal of race, or race is perceived as kind of scandalous in this field, right? They feel it to be discrediting. They see it as a kind of problem. Racial science, they say, as often flawed and lacking tools to really substantiate the hypothesis of genetic causes for racial differences. Yet rather than rejecting race, they kind of hold it at an arm's length. It's not exactly thrown out of the field, it's not embraced, but it's kind of held at arm's length. Okay, this is sort of part of us, but we don't exactly like it. Okay, so how can we explain this? Now I want to go back in time in history a little bit, back to the 60s. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways to narrate the history of behavioral genetics. Lots of people like to go back to Galton, like to go back to the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. My story really starts in the 1950s and 60s, when behavioral geneticists thought they could form a new transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary field devoted to the questions of the genetics of behavior. But they were doing it under the shadow of World War II and the Nazi use of eugenics and scientific racism. And so what they were really trying to do was, can we reconstitute this field on a non-racist, non-eugenic basis? And one of the ways that they thought they would do that is by making animal research a guide to human research, right? So stuff with mice and flies would focus the field on the real science, on the very strict and rigorous definitions, not cultural, not subjective definitions of behavior, and it would be a guide to the human research. Also, the idea of heritability estimation, I'm not going to go into that very much, but the idea of this sort of using twin studies or adoption studies to partition the genetic and environmental components to behavior. I mean, even in 1960, in the 50s and 60s, people are saying, yeah, heritability is not a big deal. Let's get beyond that and do other kinds of research. Okay, so at that time, in 1967, Spuler and Lindsay, you may have remembered those names. I'll come back to that again, though. They wrote an important review article that was trying to sort of lay out this new field, along with other articles. And they said, look, race has no part of behavior genetics. The concept of race has little importance to the student of human behavior. If we wanted to work in this area, it's procedurally difficult, politically dangerous, and personally repugnant. What they're saying is, look, there's a lot of great stuff to do in behavior genetics, and race just isn't going to be a part of that. Okay, but what happened was in 1969, I already said some of this, that Jensen he wrote his very infamous article, it's a 123-page article in the Harvard Educational Review, that called How Much Can We Boost IQ and Achievement, and something, there's another part of the subtitle that I'm forgetting right now, I'm sorry. But he basically said that he drew from all parts of behavior genetics to argue that IQ is largely genetically determined, and that the black-white IQ gap had a significant genetic component too, probably. And so therefore his conclusion was that compensatory education, he's thinking of Head Start programs and a lot of the Great Society programs that were started in the 60s, that those are bound to fail, and we should retrench from that and do something different in terms of social policy. Okay, so critics slammed Jensen, and they slammed human behavior genetics. I mean, this was a tremendous scandal. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of articles were written in response to this work from all different kinds of fields, social sciences, natural sciences, et cetera. But just as a standout of one set of very persistent and very harsh critics, so Richard Lowenton, Leon Kamen, and Stephen Rose, in 1984, 10, 12 years after this stuff, would write a book called Not in Our Genes that is one of the classic critiques of genetics and behavioral genetics research. And what they did was, so Lowenton, for example, he strongly criticized heritability as a causal parameter. He said, it just cannot make causal claims about it's not robust enough to make genetic deterministic claims. And he strongly disputed the idea that race could be studied rationally in these terms. Kamen strongly criticized the data sets of the original IQ research and twin studies, and he basically uncovered through this process what would ultimately, the accusations that Cyril Burt had faked a lot of his data. And all of them sort of made this ideological critique was a major component of their challenge to behavior genetics, in which they said that, it's not possible to do a behavior genetics that is apolitical. It's not possible to, and it's not so much a bias issue, it's that the very questions that could be asked could only be questions about the preservation of the status quo of society, and they all considered themselves revolutionary Marxists of various kinds, and that this was antithetical to their kind of politics and science. So their criticism overall was very harsh. It wasn't excise the tumor. It wasn't get rid of Jensen and throw him out of science. It was euthanize the patient. It was behavior genetics has no part of good science. That was sort of the harshest critic's line. Okay, so let's go inside the field of behavior genetics. There was a debate within behavior genetics. On the more radical side, you had people like Jerry Hirsch, or Jerry Hirsch was a key organizer. He was another fruit fly geneticist. And he said, look, let's go back to what we said 5 years ago when we said that race wasn't a part of this field. Let's excise the tumor. Let's throw Jensen out and say that he's not part of good science. Sandra Scar, on the other hand, was another key behavior geneticist. She was a human psychologist And she was also a colleague of Jensen, less interested in his genetics work at the time, but more his IQ work, his work on G and the theory of IQ. And her argument was like, no, behavior genetics could be a middle ground between the extreme politicization of the critics on this side and the extreme politicization of the pro-race folks. And it wasn't only Jensen at this time, there was also Eysenck and a whole bunch of others. And she said, look, behavior genetics can sort of be in the middle here and adjudicate between these two extremes. And ultimately, read my book if you want to know the details of the whole story. But behavior genetics ended up rallying around that middle ground position, right? So the critics, and part of this was because the critics were so extreme that they left no ground for behavior genetics to stand on, right? And they also largely ignored and denigrated the animal behavior geneticists. So the animal behavior geneticists ended up being sort of cut off from potential allies and the critics elsewhere, and losing strength to the sort of middle ground position within the field. So the sort of Jensen faction was seen as, that they tried to make, again, they saw the extremes as political, themselves as scientific, but at the same time, Jensen was contributory to the field in many other ways, right? So as I mentioned before, he did work that is still absolutely respected very widely on G, on IQ, on developing IQ tests, and so forth. And so the field found it easier to rally around Jensen's position, which seemed much more scientific than the critics' position. Okay, but this middle ground had this funny characteristic, which it ends up endorsing Jensen, right? So as I said, so when Spieler and Lindsay in '67 wrote, look, this isn't part of science, 8 years later, they end up sort of supporting the field precisely by saying that we're in the middle ground here. Well, it might be a little bit genetic and a little bit environmental and a little bit of bias. And so this kind of middle ground, all these factors have some kind of legitimacy, ends up endorsing essentially what Jensen said. So in the aftermath of the sort of 70s, as things sort of cooled down towards the 80s, geneticists and most social scientists fled the field and often ended up denouncing it as a sanctuary for bad science and bad ideas. Psychologists came to dominate the field, and animal researchers became much more weakened in the field. And therefore, that the kinds of things that those psychologists wanted to do, more heritability studies and heritability estimation, came to take over a lot of the scientific agenda of the field. At the same time, the field and the scientists within the field developed a kind of bunker mentality, so they saw deep criticism as political and not scientific, and so they didn't continue to challenge things like the race question. And they ended up with this very sort of absolutist understanding of scientific freedom that I mentioned before. And thereafter, race researchers have found a kind of uncomfortable sanctuary, right? So they don't like it when the race researchers get highly political, but they feel that they have to kind of accept it as part of the scientific discourse. Okay, so let me go to that last part in the last 5 or 7 minutes of the talk. I want to talk about how that history, I don't think, is quite sufficient to explain the sustained presence of race researchers in the field. And I think to understand that, we need to think about how those race researchers help build scientific authority for the field, despite the fact that they, in some sense, propagate illegitimacy through the field, right? So in a kind of I'll be a sociologist for a second. When we think about Max Weber and Robert Merton's way of thinking about the sociology of science, they always thought about scientific authority came through its adherence to sort of legitimate, rational procedures and so forth. And that was sort of the essence of science and why it was distinct from other social domains. And from that point of view, the story I told you before makes it seem like, well, this is going to be all corrosive. This whole story is going to be corrosive to behavior genetics scientific authority. But I think we need to sort of shift gears and see authority as built out of a whole bunch of charismatic and sort of psychosocial dynamics And for that, I turned to the social theorist Richard Sennett, who talked about authority as constituted out of images of strength. And so what I want to argue is just give you a few examples about how race claims help behavior geneticists build certain kinds of images of strength. Okay, so one example is that it helps them, it helps them position themselves as reasonable in a way, right? So part of this is that middle ground position that I mentioned before, right? And that what they want to say about themselves is, we're the field that is sort of uniquely capable of handling behavior genetics in a handling race in a reasonable and rational way, when social scientists and even geneticists have been cowardly and political about this whole question. And so this is a quote that talked about that 1994 response to the bell curve. And his argument was, look, we're doing reasonable science here. This was a behavior geneticist who was characterizing his colleagues. And he said, I think that their position is, don't associate my research with that race stuff. That's just one little thing. And what we're doing here is reasonable, responsible science. And we're not really part of that effort, but we will engage it in a responsible and scientific manner. Another thing that I think race helps behavior geneticists do is establish its importance as a field. And we've heard a couple other people talk about this idea. And so this is actually a quote from the same scientist. He told me, look, the most common question that people ask me is, what about the race thing? He said, people always come up to me and they ask, and they're not racist people, but they want to know, come on, tell me, there's a reason why black people aren't doing so well in society. It's got to be genetic, right? Or is it? You tell me, right? And so in a way, this question being in the field and behavior genetics having kind of an association with this question focuses a lot of attention on the field. It makes people understand that the stakes of behavior genetics are extremely high, even though it's a very small and in some ways marginal field in other ways. It also has helped them, I mentioned this before, but present themselves as uniquely courageous. And so Sandra Scar, in her presidential address to the Behavior Genetics Association in 1986, narrated a fist fight that broke out when Jensen came to visit her university, and how the behavior geneticists were courageous and the university officials were craven. And she says, look, those were heady days, not unlike fighting the Nazis of an earlier era. And in the short run, we freedom fighters did not win, but now we have won, she says. Okay. And then another version of this actually occurred in 1995. This is right at the bell curve and Rushton point, when the then president of the Behavior Genetics Association, Glade Whitney, remarked that behavior genetics is really revolutionary science, and he tried to link the field to the Copernican revolution. And he said, our field is revolutionary. One day this era will be called the Galtonian, or this field will be responsible for the Galtonian revolution. That we will have defined individual differences as genetically based, and our next step for the field is to carry this revolution forward and establish a similar revolution for group differences, by which he means racial differences, and explain them. Okay, and this was highly controversial and so forth, but I'm not going to go into that either. So let me just conclude this way. So I've offered this kind of explanation about why behavior genetics ends up being a sanctuary for scientific racism or race researchers, right? So I don't think it's because behavior geneticists are secretly racist, or that they believe that the science is an inconvenient truth. It just fundamentally does show the race differences to be genetically determined. Rather, that it's the history of the racial controversy, starting in 1969, but there are other elements that have continued past that point, but that the history of dealing with that controversy in some ways compelled them. It shaped the relations among scientists within the field and compelled them to hold on to behavior geneticists at a kind of arm length. And at the same time, that the continuing association with race research has helped behavior geneticists, or has given them a certain kind of authority through certain images of strength that have allowed them to sort of present, on the one hand, identities of behavioral geneticists as scientists, but also the kind of public image and the way that they communicate the import and the stakes of their field more broadly. And I think that I'll just conclude with a question. Maybe we can discuss this a little bit in question and answer. But perhaps this kind of analysis, this kind of thinking about scientific authority, can help us explain the endurance of race in other parts of science. So we've talked about the slipperiness of the race concept and about how adaptable it is to different research agendas, different public and communicative agendas. But I think part of it is that it is something that everyone agrees is extremely important and vexing in society, and that keeps giving fields that engage it, scientists that engage it, a lot of symbolic resources, essentially, and a lot of authority that those resources potentially endow them with. All right, thank you very much.